You can see that from a beginner weightlifter that is weaker than an elite athlete, at first when they start to train, their strength increases relatively quickly, and therefore they see more benefits of the training. This is due to it being much easier for a beginner to see results more quickly with regular training. However, we can see that the graph continues to increase, but at a slower rate due to the shallower gradient. This is because the advanced athletes are still gaining benefits from the strength training, but these are much less noticeable, and they are more at risk of exhaustion and needing longer recovery in order to allow the stress of lifting these heavier weights on their muscles to allow the microfibrils to recover to prevent the micro tears. This puts them at a higher risk of developing an injury than the beginners due to the heavier weights and more repetitions. This change in strength gain is largely due to neuromuscular adaptations. Gabriel, Kamen and Frost 2006 described neuromuscular adaptations as an increase in neural output from the central nervous system to the active muscle fibres. The micro tears that are sustained during resistance exercise and training, such as weight training, means that your muscles are being put under stress to the point that tiny tears occur in the muscle fibres. These micro tears cause swelling in the muscle tissue, which causes pressure on the nerve endings and pain. Training improvements will only be made if the body has rested and had adequate time to recover and repair these micro tears, making the muscle a little bit stronger than it was before. And this can be used by proteins in order to help repair muscle tissue that the athlete will consume. And obviously, because resistance training is so high intensity, there is a risk of DOMS, which is delayed onset of muscle, if the athlete has not properly warmed up the muscles and cooled them down properly. The effects can last 24 to 48 hours and even longer if there's not adequate time to recover and the athlete is training too regularly by overtraining and not implementing the progressive overload principle. And this graph on the right similarly is just showing the lifting concentric tempo does not affect hypertrophy because the reduced slower tempos decreases the motor unit recruitment, while fast tempos decrease the force exerted by the working fibres. So we can see that the graph, the bar speed decreases as the duration increases. So when you're moving the bar with submaximal effort, fatigue causes motor unit recruitment to increase over the set. And because it's so fast and maximal, the bar speed actually slows over the set as well. So the muscle fibres of high threshold motor units grow after strength training, and muscle fibres only grow when they experience a high level of mechanical tension in the concentric phase. So if only a low threshold motor units are recruited, then mechanical tension is low and little hypertrophy occurs. So the slow lifting tempos involve increasing the force by the individual muscle fibres, but effort is not maximal, so the high threshold motor units are not recruited, whereas fast tempo involve increased motor unit recruitment, but fast bar speeds mean mechanical loading on each fibre is lower. And this is all to do with the image down here showing the hypertrophy, which we're about to come to now. And muscular hypertrophy is in fact another adaptation, which is a result of long-term training. This is where the muscles increase in size and therefore the athlete improves their stamina and muscle tone because of the increased cross-sectional size of the existing muscle tissue caused by the increase in the myofibrils. This is the first modification to an athlete, which then allows other adaptations to commence. So really this is the main sort of adaptation that occurs from neuromuscular adaptations. Within the body, we have three different types of muscle fibres. These are the slow oxidative, fast oxidative glycolytic, and fast glycolytic fibres, which are developed depending on the type of sport you participate in, whether it is aerobic, where you'd have more type 1, or anaerobic, where you'd have more type 1,1X fibres, which are the fast glycolytic. As weightlifting is a high intensity exercise, the fibres that are adapted the most are the fast oxidative and fast glycolytic fibres, due to the morphological of the type 1,1X merging into type 1,1A fibres. This results in the hypertrophy of these fibres, so the myofibril expands in size, which allows them to increase their capability to store glycogen over less efficient stores. And previously, going back to the idea we didn't mention in the previous slide, was the all or none law. And in order for a muscle to contract, it must receive a nerve impulse, and this stimulus must be sufficient to activate at least one motor unit, which contains the motor neuron and the attached muscle fibres. So once activated, all the muscle fibres within the motor unit will contract to produce a muscle twitch. And linking back to the idea of the weightlifter having more fast glycolytic fibres, that means more motor units will need to be contracted and the more larger motor units in order to initiate the muscle contraction for the bigger muscle groups so they can produce more force. And by increasing the size of the muscles means there is increased number and size of the mitochondria. So when the muscles are overloaded as part of resistance training, the muscle fibres hypertrophy, and therefore within the muscle fibres the tiny structures known as the mitochondria, which are responsible for energy production, in fact actually increase in size also. And we're going to look at that more in the energy system section. And lastly, the adaptation of increased myoglobin stores. So myoglobin is a type of hemoglobin which is found exclusively in the muscles. It is responsible for binding and storing oxygen in the blood within skeletal muscles. By following a planned program, you can increase the amount of myoglobin stored in your muscles so that it can transport the oxygen to the mitochondria, which have also undergone adaptations, in turn to release more energy from aerobic respiration. The more myoglobin you have, this means the more energy will be available for the muscle. And by having more ATP means we can actually maintain this intensity for longer. And this is more of a aerobic adaptation, which we're going to look at later on. So in terms of our investigation data from the Wingate test, we can see that the graph on the left seems to actually remain at quite a constant level, so the power never actually exceeds 8 watts per kilogram, and it sort of increases and decreases as we increase the time at a constant level, and there are small changes when we increase the time, and therefore because we need more force in order to maintain this high intensity. The brain would have been recruiting more motor units, particularly fast glycolytic and fast oxidative glycolytic fibres, in order to gain the highest peak force, so we can recruit the larger motor units in the latter stages. Because at the start the resistance was lower in the beginning, there was no resistance, so we would have been recruiting the slower oxidative fibres, because the athlete, you could say, was working using their ATPPC system, so they're not working at that high of an intensity at the moment. So little force is actually needed in order to pedal. However, as the intensity increased, we needed to generate the larger forces because of the increasing intensity, and the athlete, in order to overcome the resistance, so they can continue to pedal at the same rate. And this links back to the idea of nervous inhibition, which is how our central nervous system responds to feedback from the muscle tissue. This prevents overtraining and therefore reduces the risk of injury as the muscle experiences high levels of force. So this athlete could have actually undergone long-term adaptations in order to sustain this intensity, because of having more flexible muscle fibres and tendons and ligaments means they could have been able to sustain this intensity over time. And from this, we can see that as we increased the force, the athlete was having to work harder in order to meet the demands of exercise. And this is why we can see maybe quite towards the end drop in their performance, because they weren't actually able to sustain the power needed. Now we're going to be looking at energy systems, and long-term training results in metabolic adaptations in the body, which allows the energy systems to become more efficient, so more energy is utilised in the sports, so we can delay using our anaerobic system and therefore delay or reduce the effects of fatigue. A weightlifter's training program, which consists of strength, power and speed exercises in their resistance training, help to make these adaptations by utilising the anaerobic pathways. Over time, we can see that athletes' bodies become more efficient at storing phosphocreatine and carbohydrates in the muscles, so they can have immediate access to ATP without needing oxygen to produce it and break it down. By having an increased and better storage allows an improved ability of the ATP-PC system. So in sports like weightlifting that are anaerobic and high intensity, it means this system can't be prolonged, so we can delay using our glycolysis system so we don't produce the waste products due to not having oxygen to replenish the ATP stores, and therefore forcing the weightlifter to drop the weight or give up in trying to fully execute the lift. Another factor is the anaerobic of this is if we can work using our PC system for longer, because we are sort of storing, replenishing our phosphocreatine stores or delaying the amount of time we can prolong them, means that we're not going to be using our lactic acid system as earlier. So we're sort of then reducing the time for fatigue, so we don't produce the waste products of lactic acid. Although lactic acid does have some useful benefits and it can be broken down and buffered, as shown by the picture on the bottom, still at all costs we want to try and avoid it as much as we can. So if we can continue to use our PC system to delay it even longer, then we're going to reduce the time to fatigue, and therefore we can sustain the intensity for longer. So that is really beneficial to athletes, anaerobic athletes, so they can potentially place better in the competition and work much harder. Another factor is the anaerobic enzyme activity. We have enzymes within our bodies that help to catalyse the biological reactions so we can break down substances quickly, so they can be used and stored more effectively. Long-term training allows us to have more anaerobic enzymes to break down glucose more efficiently. This is because by having an improved breakdown of phosphocreatine by the enzyme phosphocreatine kinase, which helps to further break down ATP and glucose to form lactate, increases. So this allows the athlete to extend the capacity of the ATP-PC system during their strength performance. And by having these increased anaerobic enzymes, because they are responsible for manufacturing more ATP, means we can actually make an increased amount to maintain the intensity of the exercise. They help to increase the control of the anaerobic phase when breaking down glucose, so we can produce more energy. And as we previously mentioned, this means that there's an increase in the numbers of mitochondria, so more energy can be supplied to the muscles of the athlete so they can work at a higher intensity for longer. This means there'll be more ATP stored in the muscles, which can be immediately used by the athlete, so they're not having to use oxygen in order to break down the products and therefore compromise their performance by working aerobically. And this diagram here just demonstrates the lactic acid system, how the products come from the muscle sarcoplasm. So this glycogen gets broken down into glucose stored in the muscles or the liver by glycogen phosphorylase. Then glucose further gets broken down by PFK, phosphofructase kinase, into pyruvic acid. Then, if there is oxygen available and the athlete wants to work aerobically, because that's the demands of their sport, then oxygen can be used, and that can go in something called the Krebs cycle and the electron transport train. However, if there is no oxygen present, then LDH further breaks it down to lactic acid, and this is where we get the waste products from. And overall, this actually only yields about 2 ATP, which isn't really beneficial to the athlete. Whereas what we get in aerobic respiration, we get 34 ATP. So it's quite different. And here we just have two graphs showing some evidence for the different energy stores that we can use and sort of how we use our energy in the different energy systems. So fats are mainly used as a last resort in aerobic activities, and this is because they are large molecules that require to be broken down, and this is difficult at the start of exercise, especially in a short duration. Because they are complex, they need to be broken down over a longer period of time, and this is because the fat oxidation increases as sort of exercise goes on, and so they can be broken down faster. Fats overall provide more ATP than carbohydrates, but as we have said, they require oxygen to be oxidised, so are only appropriate really in endurance sports, like a marathon runner, and especially towards the end of a marathon race, as the glycogen stores start to deplete. Carbo loading is a technique that they use to help reduce fats being used.